Ultimately, the way that we organize our speech is going to depend greatly upon the topic that we choose. But there are a lot of different ways that we can organize our speeches, specifically in informative speeches. So these are the common organizing patterns that we can use. The first of these is categorical or topical, and this is the most common organizing pattern that people tend to use in informative speeches. When we use categorical or topical organization, we are creating categories of information, or basically subtopics of our bigger topic. For example, I might give an informative speech about the Walt Disney Company, where my specific purpose is to inform my audience about the Walt Disney Travel Company and all of its different parts. My first main point might be about the Disney parks. My second main point would be about the Disney resorts, and my third main point would be about the Disney Cruise Line. In my first main point, I would talk about how there are parks not only here in the United States, but also abroad. So we have Disneyland in California, Disney World in Florida, Disneyland Paris, there's Hong Kong and Tokyo and Shanghai. And that would be my first main point, talking just about the parks. That's it. And I might talk about some differences that exist between the domestic parks and the international ones. My second main point then would be about the resorts, about the hotels that exist on Disney property. And I would talk about the ones that are attached to the resorts or to the parks that I just talked about, but I would also talk about the ones that are not attached to a park, like Aulani in Hawaii, for example. My third main point would then be about the cruises, and I could talk about all of the different places that the Disney Cruise Line goes and what amenities the different ships have and stuff like that. So you can see the different subtopics of the overarching Walt Disney Travel Company. Similarly, I might give a speech with a specific purpose to persuade my audience to apply to attend a generic university, and my first main point might be about life in the dorms. My second main point might be about life in the classroom, and my third main point might be about life on campus. So you can see that there are clear subtopics of my overarching topic. Another type of speech that we could give is the comparison and contrast speech. And this is where you are describing the similarities and differences between two things. You're informing your audience about how these things are similar and different from one another. In theory, you could create a third main point by giving some basic background information about the two things that are being compared or contrasted, but if you're just talking about the similarities and differences, it would be two main points. For example, I could give a speech informing my audience of a group of physicians about drug X, which is newer and has better applications than drug Y. For example, I might talk about the difference between Advil and Tylenol, or acetaminophen and aspirin. And so my first main point would be about how acetaminophen and aspirin are similar to one another, and my second main point might be about how the two are different, and how one is better for headaches and the other is better for body aches, or something along those lines. But I would weigh the two things and talk about how they are alike and how they are not. If I'm using spatial organization, I'm following some sort of directional pattern and seeing how things fit together in a physical space. For example, I could give my speech informing my audience about manifest destiny and how the United States expanded and became the landmass that we know today. My first main point would be about the original 13 colonies on the east coast of the United States. My second main point would be about moving westward and maybe with the Louisiana Purchase, how we gained more land west of the Mississippi. And then finally, my last main point would be about the Oregon Territory, or the Mexican cession that gave us the land all the way to the west coast. So I moved literally from the east coast to the west coast, followed a directional pattern in that way. I might also give my speech, I might give a speech about hurricanes and how hurricanes work. And I would start on the outside of the hurricane with the tendrils of rain that bring somewhat heavy rain and high wind speeds to the area that it's passing over, right? It's kind of the very outside of the storm. And I would describe in my second main point how when you move inward in the storm, the wind and rain gets more intense. It rains heavier, the winds pick up in speed, hundreds of miles per hour. We start seeing shingles be ripped off of roofs, that sort of thing. And then my third main point might be about the eye of the hurricane, the very center, where there's very little rain and hardly any wind. And it's kind of the calm in the middle of the storm. And then talk about how when you go back out, you experience the same things that you did when you went into the storm. So I'm literally moving from outside the hurricane to the very center, directional pattern. I might also follow a chronological pattern, which follows a time pattern. So we're looking at events that take place over a period of time, and I'm talking about it in the order in which they appear, from backward to, or from beginning to end. So, for example, I might give a history about I might give a speech about the history of rock and roll and how rock and roll emerged in the 1940s from African American styles of blues, and how in the 1950s we came to the rockabilly type of rock and roll with artists like Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley. And then in the 1960s, how rock and roll kind of lost its fever in America, but rock and roll fever very much was picking up in the UK, in Britain, and that's how we got bands like The Who and the Beatles. So my speech went from the 1940s to the 1950s to the 1960s. This is also the type of speech pattern that you might use if you are giving a speech about a person's life. You would follow their life from young adulthood to their current life and possibly to any future projects that they're working on. So you go from beginning to end, from past to present to future, that sort of thing. Finally, you might give a causal speech. And this is where you explain the cause and effect relationships between two things. So your first main point would talk about the causes of the phenomenon that you're talking about, right? The underlying causes. And then your second main point would talk about the effects of that. For example, I might give a speech informing local voters about the problem of domestic violence in a city. And my main points would first explain that there are significantly more arrests in our city, and I would describe the causes and effects that has, right? So the cause of this is that maybe it's not as controlled, or maybe it's kind of the norm, it's not spoken about much. And then the effect of that is that we have a lot more victims of domestic violence that isn't being responded to properly. Right? So you're weighing sort of like the reason that something happens and then the ultimate outcome of that problem. That's what causal reasoning does. This one can start to get a little bit persuasive if you're not careful. So I would recommend always thinking about that and thinking about whether or not your speech sounds too persuasive. But generally speaking, if you are giving an informative speech and it's categorical, comparison, contrast, spatial, or chronological, you're going to be just fine. Causal is the one that just kind of teeters on the fence. Using any one of these organizational patterns is going to depend greatly upon the topic that you are talking about. So I suggest playing around with it a little bit and trying to figure out which one is going to work best for your speech.